Welcome to Inside Black Iowa. I'm Dana James, your host, and I have some guests today from Just Voices Iowa. Just Voices Iowa bills itself as part of a movement to end racial profiling in Des Moines. So, welcome today, Harvey and Lori.
Thanks. My name's Harvey Harrison. I started Just Voices Iowa several years ago now, and our purpose in it is to gain information about how policing operates in the city of Des Moines. And we do that in a number of ways, which we'll talk about, and then use that data and our collaboration and our alliances with other nonprofit organizations to try to make systemic changes in how policing is done in our city and state.
Fantastic, Lori.
Yeah, I'm Lori Young. I'm a native of Des Moines, Iowa, born and raised here. At Just Voices, I am the Communications and Operations Director. So Harvey and I work closely together. We're basically a two-man team. I handle all facets of communication for the nonprofit website, collateral, video production, video script writing, interviewing, feature writing. So that's what I do.
Fantastic. Well, I know obviously Black Iowa News has, we have a great relationship, and I was very happy to be able to be part of publishing the People's History. And I really enjoyed seeing people interact with those stories, and they've certainly made an impression on me too. And I want you to talk a little bit about what the People's History is, why it's important, why you did it.
After George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020, as everybody knows, the nation erupted in protest against police violence and the horrible way in which he was murdered by an officer of the state or the city of Minneapolis. We at Just Voices, as you know, our mission is to end racially biased policing in Des Moines. So we were already working in that arena as a nonprofit. We learned after George Floyd's murder that many cities in the United States, some larger, some smaller than Des Moines, had done an extensive, what they call an after action review. Anytime a police department goes through a large scale crisis event, a good police department will go back and review how they handled that. So the summer of 2020 protests, there were over 40 in Des Moines. And so we were expecting our Des Moines Police Department to do an after action review because we had heard stories of violence and militaristic response. Well, the Des Moines Police Department never did a thorough after action review. So Just Voices decided we would do one. And our purpose was to answer questions like, was the Des Moines Police Department response appropriate? How many people were arrested? How many were found guilty? Did the Des Moines Police Department follow best practices among police departments across the country? We also wanted to know, was there disproportionate arrest of Black and brown people that summer in comparison to our racial makeup in the city? So we were looking for answers to questions like that. And we wanted to collect stories of the protesters, the people that were there on the streets protesting that summer. A lot of what Just Voices does is storytelling, and we give voice and give platform to victims of police misconduct, police violence. So we also wanted to talk to protesters, interview them, and collect their stories. So the People's History is a collection of roughly 10 to 12 essays that we've written over the last 2 years. We pulled them all together under one cover.
Well, I want to echo what Lori said. We wouldn't be doing this at all if the Des Moines Police Department had done an after action review on their own. And I want to stress that because this is something that the U.S. Department of Justice recommends. And not only do they recommend it, but they have a model for how an after action review is supposed to be done and used then as a tool by progressive police departments to study their own work and use it as a way to improve their performance. So it was disturbing at best when the Des Moines would not do that. and when the city manager and the city council in Des Moines wouldn't compel that to be done. So I want to echo what Lori said about that.
It sounds like it's a service really to Des Moines and to Iowa that you all stepped in to do something that the police department is unwilling to do, that self review. Do you think that that means that they were cool with what they did, how they handled the protest, how their officers behaved, or do they just not want to? Are they just not wanting to work with the public?
Lori, let me start with that, if you don't
Mhm.
mind. I think it's consistent with the history that we've had since basically 2015 in efforts to work with the Des Moines Police Department to turn it into a progressive police department. Over those years, they have come to the point where they won't even sit down and talk with us about the stuff that we're producing and showing. So I think, one, it's consistent with prior history. The chief of police for the last 5 years has essentially refused to sit down with us at all and talk with us, with one small exception, which didn't go very well. Again, it's consistent with it. The things that have been suggested, we've been pushing improved data collection since 2018 in different ways. And we did that because we were collecting data on what the police department was doing, and there was a gap in it, which we knew, which was if somebody got stopped on a traffic stop, uh, if there was not a citation issued specifically or an arrest, there wasn't a record of that stop. Well, ultimately, the police chief in October of 22 issued an order that required collection on all stops and never bothered to tell the public that he was doing that. Everything that we've experienced in this project is consistent with the history that we have experienced with the Des Moines Police Department over the last years.
We have found the Des Moines Police Department very difficult to collaborate with and dialogue with. Just out and out refuse to talk to us. They've been extended many invitations. This is not our first research project, it's our largest one, the People's History, but we did one in 2021 where we studied the Special Enforcement Team, which is a special tactical unit of the Des Moines Police Department that operates in the summer months to find drugs and guns. When we studied 5 years of data on that special enforcement team, we found that 64% of their arrests were Black people for marijuana possession. Yet we only make up 12% of the city's population. So they were targeting areas of our city heavily populated by Black and Brown people. When we released that study, the Des Moines police found an issue with a piece of data that was in that study. We said, okay, let's sit down and talk about it. If our data's wrong, if we've miscalculated something, we'd like to talk to you about it. They did not, they declined that invitation as well. So, yeah, I don't think they really want to talk about how they performed in 2020. One thing that's in the study is all the lawsuits that were waged against the city and the Des Moines Police Department for misconduct. Several are still pending here in 2024. They have not been settled. So, you know, I think they would just like to move on and forget it. Yeah.
Well, really, we can't forget it because a lot of what happened after George Floyd was murdered, I have video in my phone right now. I'm sure plenty of
Hmm.
other people have videos from the protest. A lot of it is out there. So we got to see them in action. It was really startling. And some
Yeah.
of the pieces from the People's History that ran exclusively in Black Iowa News really have stayed with me, even just as a reader. The trauma that the protesters and even people who weren't necessarily probably viewed themselves as protesters. They were going. Some of them just went to help
Hmm.
other people, and then they get dragged into situations where they're physically and mentally harmed, and they're still carrying that today. And I
Hmm.
think that is why the work that you're doing with the people's history and staying on this issue is so important because we cannot let what happened in 2020 happen again. We cannot condone the things that we saw that were, very anti-black, just anti-people.
And this is an overview kind of a comment about it. I think Lori and I both strongly believe that the things that we've recommended over the years, some of the things that we have found as a result of the study that we've done on the people's history, would in fact not only improve policing as a whole, but would improve the relationship between the police department and the community itself, and particularly the Black community and the Latino community with it. Because one of the things that we knew from the start, anecdotally, was that feeling of disconnect that existed between the Black community, believing they were being targeted and oppressed with it. So that's number one, is we think that the things that are being recommended improve things for everybody, including the
Hmm.
officers. Uh, and I think both of us believe that to our core. The
Yes.
second thing is that in the study itself, um, Alan Tunks, who is now the assistant chief of police, he commented, as did a couple of the other people that were interviewed. Uh, in Tunk's case, he did a deposition, so he was under oath on it. And he acknowledged that the Des Moines Police Department wasn't ready for what happened. And I again believe that as a consequence of their unpreparedness, some of the violence that occurred in that first weekend in particular would not have happened if the Des Moines Police Department had been prepared for a kind of intense protest that happened then. And personally, I think also that, remember, this is COVID time. People had been cooped up inside, and then all of a sudden you got to watch this horrific murder on, live stream on TV, on your computers, and everywhere. And I think the combination of all those things, you took 400 years of the oppression of Black people in our country and the enslavement in our country, and I think that just exploded into a final kind of release of some of that tension. It wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I will add to that, Harvey. I think that's a good point. Is we can't forget George Floyd's murder. This May 25th, it'll be 4 years. I look at it as one of the most significant parts of American history, right up there with 9/11, Oklahoma City bombing. Everyone says we will never forget 9/11, and we don't. We will never forget the Holocaust. That didn't happen here, but so we cannot allow people to forget that flash moment in our history that was so, it reverberated around the world. And if nothing good can come of it except that Derek Chauvin and those officers have now been jailed, that's good. But we need change. And if that doesn't make America change its criminal justice system, we call it criminal legal system because there's not a lot of justice for some races. I don't know what will. I don't want to ever see another George Floyd, And we know that, police violence and murders by police officers are still happening and even increasing since George Floyd's murder. So we do this people's history because we won't let Des Moines or America forget.
So, given the fact that the police, Des Moines police, are reluctant or haven't interacted with you, do you feel like, are they changing at all in a way that will make what they do more
Mhm.
just, or not? Because if they're not
Mhm.
changing, then there's the fear that some other tragic happening comes along, and we have these protesters back out there, and they won't they won't have learned a thing about how to
Mhm.
interact with them, how to de-escalate, how to make it so that we're not seeing what we saw.
I think you've already seen the example of that, Dana. I It's my memory, but I never remember the young 16-year-old young man's name who got shot by the police. Um, you'll recall that was it December of 2022. Several things had been changed in terms of the protocols. The written protocols had been created, like the initiation of a crisis intervention unit, which was designed to have a mental health professional in the dispatcher's office in the Des Moines Police Department. This is a progressive, much needed change that's been happening around the United States, and Des Moines was adopting it. So now you get what amounts to a serious incident where no mental health officer was involved in this, as far as I know. You had officers go in, and within 4 minutes of the entry of those officers, uh, they shot this young man. Well, that's not a change. And
Mhm.
then on top of that, they rushed really to a decision from the state attorney general's office saying it was a justifiable shooting, and yet won't release that video coverage, the body camera coverage, to the public so that we can independently make our own decisions of whether or not that was a justifiable shooting. So when you ask if things changed, I think some have with it. I think that, and the crisis intervention unit is a good example of that. It's a great step forward if it's properly applied. But there's also things that haven't changed in a situation. And of course, there's now a lawsuit around that shooting. So eventually, that lawsuit will work its way out. We'll understand all of the facts of it. And it'll be a jury that will decide whether or not that shooting was justifiable or not. So it's a hard thing to answer for you. There have been some
Mhm.
changes, but that kid should not have died. Just shouldn't have happened.
Has it, and your question of has there been any change? Some changes are on paper only, you know. They look good, they look symbolic. The city of Des Moines did pass an anti-racial profiling ordinance in June of 2020, which basically says racial profiling is illegal in our city. Does that mean it ended? No, it didn't end. You know, you often hear when people talk about reform or police reform, they need more training. They need more training. I personally believe you can't train bias out of someone. I don't care
Mm.
how many classes you sit through and videos you watch. It's a change of the heart. And as a faith believing woman, I think that's God's work. Sometimes something might get through and make people stop and evaluate themselves enough that they do change. So I'm not sure training is the answer. I'm glad that the Des Moines Police Department now, because of community pressure, offers annual de escalation training. That wasn't happening a few years ago. We know that marijuana enforcement by the SET team was very racially disparate. We know that that SET team is no longer in operation, which is good. But we know marijuana arrests are still happening for personal level usage, and that it is still a disparity between black and whites, although black and whites smoke marijuana at the same rate, according to the ACLU. So, yeah, there's fewer marijuana arrests, but the racial disparity is still there. So, and then as Harvey mentioned, when Chief Wingard wrote up a new policy where they will collect data on all traffic stops,
Mhm.
whether a ticket is issued or not, or arrest is made, we've received anecdotal information that that's not consistently being done. So it looks good on paper, but if all the officers aren't doing it, then it's really not changing anything. So we got a long way to go. And as you mentioned, Dana, we're living in a red state right now. Iowa is a red state. The legislature is passing, you know, very oppressive laws. I think, like you said, that give the police more power, more immunity. After George Floyd's murder, BLM rose up, and that stands for Black Liberation Movement in Des Moines, not Black Lives Matter, but Black Liberation Movement. They rose up and they said, hey, we want ex felons' voting rights restored. At that time, Iowa was one of the last two states in the nation that would not let an ex felon vote. And they got that passed through pressure from BLM and from the community and NAACP and others. Kim Reynolds sat down and signed an executive order and restored ex felons' voting rights with a stroke of a pen, right? Um, then she promised to form a commission to study policing in the state of Iowa. I think Betty Andrews led that effort, that commission. They made lots of great recommendations by the end of 2020. Turn around legislative session 2021, the state legislature signed back the blue law, which totally negates all the recommendations that commission she ordered to be convened had made. So it's one step forward, three steps back. What is really happening on the street? What is really happening in the minds of officers? Do they still see black people as inherently criminal? I don't know how you change that, but we're going to try. Yeah, we're going to try.
So you took all of the work that you did from the people's history, all of those rich, detailed stories that we really need to have as that true, like, historical record of what happened, and you put those into what?
Lori is the producer of what we end up with as a final product on it. So, of course, what we did was we'd been collecting the information in different ways, and you gave us the vehicle through the Black Iowa News to actually get those published initially on it, which was we could then tuck them away and get them out in front of the people on it, which was a real godsend to us. To or a section of the stories that we had collected, some national data we have that have been collecting on it, some commentary about that, and we did that. And Lori was the one that took all of this and did this. Okay, my job was to provide encouragement.
Yes, it was a definite team effort. And I don't know if people realize, if you look at the magazine online or in print, we had a crew of volunteers because Harvey and I, there's no way we could have done this alone. And we sent out the call and asked for volunteers. And people came forward and they said, we'll help you with your research. We'll help you write. We'll help you interview. We'll help you comb through court records and figure out how many cases were dismissed or whatever. And we recognize them in the magazine. So know that it wasn't solely Harvey and I that got this thing done. Yeah, and we felt at some point in time, let's just stop right now and pull it all together, what we've done for 2 years, and get it out to the people. Because I think everybody recognizes the fervor after George Floyd's murders dying quickly nationwide. So we decided maybe last fall to really pull it together. One thing that was, I'll talk a little bit about the process. So when we decided to research 2020 protests, first of all, we had to find protesters that would talk to us. Some protesters we reached out to didn't want to talk to us, didn't want to be interviewed. And we find that a lot in this work because it's triggering and traumatizing for some people to keep talking about something that happened to them that was negative. But so we had to find the protesters. Harvey's a real good legal eagle, so he knew how to look up court records and all of that. We had the assistance of Gina Messimer, who is an attorney at Alfredo Parrish's law firm, Parrish Crichton. She also, would give us information and help us understand how to find information. So anyway, it was a long process to pull it all together. We wanted something that was striking, that was historical, that was compelling, that was truthful. And ultimately, everything we do at Just Voices is to get people engaged into this work of seeking and demanding truth, justice, especially for people of color in Des Moines. So what we hope is that people are inspired by these stories and essays, and that they might pick up the phone and call their council person, might pick up the phone and talk to their legislator, might join a group like Just Voices in this work, So that's what we're ultimately after. And then we were trying to find photos from the protests.
Right.
And you had hundreds of people protesting all summer long. You think that
Right.
would be easy. We learned from BLM because they were being surveilled by the Des Moines police so heavily. They had instructed all of their young, associates and members to delete all images off their cell phones, all videos. So we would turn to people trying to get photos. If we interviewed someone, we'd say, "Did you take any photos? Can we use your photos?" A lot of people didn't, or they had already deleted them from their phones. So We lucked up when we found a gentleman named Hashim, and he owns a photography company in Des Moines called HKH Photography. One of our volunteers found him, and he had went to like several protests all summer long, and as a photographer, just started snapping pictures. And so he told us we could use any of his images for free as long as we give him credit. So I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of our magazine is the imagery, and people should know that these are Des Moines protests. You might see somebody's image, I know I've seen a few people I know, but Hashim did great work, and that really adds a lot of pictures tell stories and history as well as words. So we're grateful for that. Black Iowa News agreed to publish our essays as we were writing them over the last 2 years. Not that, and that was such a blessing because you've got a huge following, you've got a huge readership, you're online, you're in print, and we wanted to get, and it was rewarding for us to release these essays to a Black owned media outlet like Black
Yep.
Iowa News. That was amazing. And then you've been so gracious in sharing on news about Just Voices and what we're up to. You've been sharing that on your social media site, and that just puts so many more eyeballs on what we're doing. So we're very grateful for that. Um, and when we knew we wanted to launch it with a big splash. So we said, let's create like a video trailer to promote the People's History is Done. And Just Voices has always committed to using people of color for all of our professional service needs. So our photographer is Black, Carlos Anthony Photography. Our social media manager is Black, vertical marketing. We also utilize Black consultant, like car consulting, when we were setting Just Voices up on how to write our mission and our strategies. So we were looking for a videographer to create this trailer. I wrote the script for it, but we found a gentleman in Atlanta who's originally from Des Moines but living in Atlanta now. His name is Matthew K, and we offered him the gig. So I worked with him for about a month to create a short 1 minute, 25-second trailer because we knew that would get a lot of attention on social media. And then we also created a 3.5 minute video about the people's history. Both of those are on our YouTube page. And then when we knew we wanted to design the magazine, we just wanted it to be striking. I believe in giving a
Yeah,
graphic
hold that
artist.
up so we can see it a
There
little
we
more.
go. But ultimately, the lady that designed this magazine for us, at least she's a woman owned business, which we're proud of. She lives in Des Moines, and she's the same lady that designs the Urban Experience magazine for Dewana Bradley and her team. Her name is Nikki Wilson, and she owns Lost Ross Graphics. It looks like my cousin said it looks like Life magazine at a glance. That
Yeah, it
Life
does have a
magazine.
retro feel to it.
Yeah, it has a retro feel.
Mm,
Yeah,
I love it. I love it. And
Well,
it
I think it's really fun to think about all the people that were brought into this, and not only that, the process of how do you find them. And I'm real proud of what it ended up looking like and being.
yeah,
it I just have not seen any other organization do the kind of work that you're doing. Not only like what you do in terms of educating all of us about racial profiling and fighting to get this data, because I know it's not easy and the other party's not willing. That aside, but just the having that historical record of what happened. I
yes,
really love that we have this beautiful magazine, we have this historical record, but we have the work underpinning all of that. So you had a community event
yeah.
to unveil the magazine.
And then we just wanted to have conversation, and there was good questions from the community. Then on Sunday, we did the exact same presentation, a little bit of a modification at First Unitarian Church. And that was a really nice turnout. They offered this community meeting following their morning services. So some members just hung around for the presentation, but we also attracted some community members just came into the church for the presentation. I'd say we had about 50, 60 people.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
great.
People were really great. And see what you can't get from the flat, two-dimensional magazine is the videos. So at the presentations, we were able to show some examples of videos of police violence that happened in 2020 that are just more visual evidence of what happened and the mistakes our police department made. So it was a successful launch weekend. So I'm going to talk about this, keep talking about this all year long. And we're planning a really major event on May 25th, which is the fourth anniversary
Mm-hmm.
of George Floyd's murder that happens to fall on a Saturday. And it's going to be at Franklin Library on Saturday, May 25th, to commemorate the fourth anniversary of George Floyd. We'll dig more into the people's history, but we'll also cover the current state of affairs in terms of police reform in Des Moines and what's really happening. So we're looking forward to that. We're really going to try to promote that well so people know the date, the time, and the place to come. It'll be free and everyone is welcome. So I.org.
Oh, cannot.
You know,
So next, what's next? Yeah, for Just Voices. Where are you guys going after this? You got the magazine. You have your research. You're making a difference.
You
Where do
we're
you
triggered
go
something
next?
else for me, though, Dana, before I move on to what's next, I, part of what is powerful, I think, in these stories is the fact that it does talk about the aftermath and the consequences to these people. And a couple of them, just to highlight, one of the stories in there is the police attack on the Blazing Saddle, which is the gate
Mm,
on the east side. And you had three young men who were down there outside in the street after the curfew was in place, and they were sitting there with uh, helping people coming down off the Capitol grounds who had been gassed and pressed off of there, and they were there to help them. And the police saw that, and if you watch the video of that, it's just horrific. The police come out of their vehicle, full military gear, armed and stuff like that. So okay, so the civil lawsuit goes away, the criminal charges go away. But now you got these three young men, one of them who won't come back his family lives in Des Moines. He ain't coming back because of the pressures of it. You've got a young man who, in the aftermath of it, one morning looks in a mirror and he's thinking, I have a gun, I'm going to kill myself.
mm.
He went into psychiatric treatment and he's recovering from that. But you don't hear that as the original part of the story on it. The the implications of this play out over time in really terrible ways. And I'll tell you the missing story in this, that because the police department won't talk to us, you've got to believe that some of these police who were trying to do their best, when not all the cops were out there beating people up. Some of those cops, I suspect, were scared to death. That story isn't in a part of these magazine at this point, and
Mm.
it needs to be told, frankly, um, with it. And they need to
Scared to
be
death. Scared to death because the police weren't prepared to deal with this type of large scale protest, or scared because they view um, people of color, certain groups, in a different way.
probably both of those things. When you
Okay.
watch the video of what happened at the Polk County Courthouse, I mean, the courthouse was actually damaged, okay? Some people went and did damage to that historic old building in the midst of the protests. I'm not in favor of that. But the police had a line drawn and they'd set it up and they were protecting the courthouse and they were doing a good job. And you saw these protesters who were throwing things at them and were yelling at them and screaming obscenities at them. Now, suppose I'm a 25-year-old kid, you know, and there's people out there that I don't know, and I don't know. I think poorly of them. You know what you've just said. if I have this underlying belief that blacks are criminals and they may be carrying guns and stuff, I'm probably scared out there. And you know, that's the kind of thing that needs to change. But it ain't going to change unless we talk about it. And then, of course, in that particular incident, this municipal tank rolls up, this militarized piece of gear, lid pops up. The officer that pops up out of that throws a gas grenade. I mean, and that's not a de-escalation. So there's stories that probably aren't going to get told, and it doesn't justify anything. But it
Right.
is part of those some of those police. They are people in a people's history. It'd be nice to have them have their stories. Lori, you want to start with what we're thinking about on volume 2, and then I'll talk about a couple of the other things.
Yeah. Before we move on, I want to just tag on to one thing you were talking about
Sure.
is the police might have been scared themselves and we didn't get to, interview any police officers. But there is a piece in the people's history where we were working with a Valley High School senior named Michael Danos. He was volunteering for Just Voices and he wanted to research the protests that happened in West Des Moines. And so he interviewed Police Chief Chris Scott, who's the chief of police for West Des Moines. And there's a large supplement in the people's history that is pretty much Chief Scott's own words. It's about 2,000 words of what he experienced and how he directed his officers to handle the protests in West Des Moines. Now they didn't have as many as Des Moines did, but they had some big ones, and they were all peaceful. Not one arrest by the West Des Moines Police Department, but he wrote a little bit of an essay and thoughts about the mental and financial toll that the protests took on officers and people.
Mm.
So he was very thoughtful. So I encourage people to read what Chief Scott of West Des Moines felt about or feels about the trauma that his officers were under that summer and what they went through. So that's important. Another quick point I want to make, I'm hoping to get some way finding a way to get the people's history in the African American Museum of Iowa, right? Because one day me and Harvey will be gone and only our kids and grandkids will have a copy. And that would be a tragedy. So we're working on that.
What our thought is about having a volume 2.
Oh, volume 2. Yeah, when we stopped in our tracks and decided to collect up what we've done, my inspiration was the 1619 Project in the New York Magazine, right? And how Nicole Hannah Jones put together all these essays written by very famous Black scholars and educators on different aspects of the Black experience in Des Moines, the impact slavery had on it. I said, that's what we've done. We've written essays. Let's pull them all together in a collection, call it a magazine. So that's where the inspiration was. We know that we have just scratched the surface. We've talked about there's about 10 or 12 essays in the magazine. There's so many more people to talk to. I would love to talk to a Matthew Bruce, who later changed his name to Matei Muhammad, very core founder of the Black Liberation Movement in Des Moines. I would love to interview Indira Shoemaker, who got active with BLM in 2020 that led her to run for city council. She was so motivated. There's a lot more stories to tell, but what we want to cover in volume 2, which I'm going to stick my neck out and say we're going to try to release it about this time next year, but it's depending on the outcome of these lawsuits. There are 7 or 8 pending lawsuits still waiting to be adjudicated. We think that will happen this summer and fall, and they'll be settled. I have a feeling that Des Moines will lose a lot of those lawsuits and have to pay some money out and to settle them. But we shall see, you know. But we think volume 2 will be more focused on the outcome of the lawsuits. What was, any settlements. Once those lawsuits are settled, hopefully those people suing the city and the police department can talk to us. Usually when they're involved in litigation, it's pending. They don't want to talk about it. Their lawyers
Right.
advise them. Yes, it would.
Yeah, it probably would.
And not to
But
mention how much money the city of Des Moines is spending
Yeah.
to appeal these cases to higher courts. Taxpayer money. legal fees, expert witness fees, expert, testimony fees. It's in the thousands and thousands of dollars just
Million.
to try to protect a cop that obviously done wrong. He did wrong and just needs to be held accountable, to the fullest extent of whatever the police department policy is, whether it's suspension, termination, or
Hmm.
whatever. Don't waste time and money trying to.
And I love that Just Voices is trying to lift the veil on all of their processes and procedures so that the people who pay their salaries, the people who are harmed by their actions or not taken care of, know what's
Yep,
happening and have
yep,
some recourse. So, well,
yep.
it has been a pleasure having you both on to talk about Just Voices, talk about your beautiful magazine and your future work. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Inside Black Iowa. And you can look for us on YouTube, Substack, and all of those places where good podcasts are. Thanks for being with us today. Have a great day.
Add one other thing to a piece on the litigation parts of it, Lori. The other
Hmm.
thing is there will be more either court testimony under oath or there'll be more depositions and interrogatories where the police will have been under test and giving testimony about what happened.
Oh yeah.
And so, if the police won't sit down with us and talk about the experience, we'll use the sworn testimony that we can get out of these public records on things like that. Because it's not in the magazine this time. We do have a statement that was given by a Johnston police officer about what happened on the kettling incident on June 22nd, where he basically describes exactly what the police were doing, was gassing people and knocking them down. And we will have more of that material as well as these litigation documents and stuff that we'll be able to use. So that's coming up. It's kind of pie in the sky. We're going to need to generate some revenue in order to be able to do that, uh, but we'll try to figure that out. The other thing that's coming up, I got interested in the data part of one of the things with it, which was the use of force reports. And my initial interest got triggered because of what it appeared to me, both from the statistics that we saw, because Des Moines publishes a high level report on how many use of force reports they have. But it appeared to me there was an anomaly between 2019 and 2020 where there were more use of force reports reported than there in 19 than there were 20. And I'm thinking, that just can't be true. It's not possible. And so I asked for the the actual report itself so we could do our own study of what was in there and see how many were. Parallel to that was the anecdotal information we were getting, which was that the police officers weren't preparing use of force reports during the protests. Part of
Mm,
the chaos that occurred was they weren't really doing all the paperwork they needed to do. That's what led to the dismissal of all the criminal charges against them. They just didn't have good paperwork in many instances.
right. And in the stories that you uplifted that were published in Black Iowa News and in your magazine, some of that we see it clearly
Oh,
that
yeah.
there's that arguments about the lack of paperwork and who was supposed to do what,
Yep.
and you see the breakdown of the
Yeah.
communication.
Well, turns out that the Des Moines Police Department and the city don't want to release use of force reports. So Gina Messimer sued the city on my behalf, and about almost a month ago now, I guess, the district court said, "Nah, those aren't protected documents. You've got to hand them over." And they then filed a notice of appeal to the Iowa Supreme Court, asking the Iowa Supreme Court to rule that we couldn't get them. So we're not done with that yet. So that's coming.
Okay.
I have taken. I am. I'm appalled, is what I really am. One of the cases involves a man named Nieters, Nieters, being sued in the federal courts, and the city has lost at the trial court level on preliminary motions, lost at the federal court of appeals level, and has filed an application on behalf of the city of Des Moines, which just gripes me, uh, to take that to the U.S. Supreme Court and have the U.S. Supreme Court that the officers were protected by a qualified immunity theory. Let's just say I'm working on that right now because that really upsets me, okay? Can I back up a step? What the city of Des Moines ought to be doing with all of these kind of things is the incident occurs, they need to do an after action review so they study and improve their. But when you get a civil lawsuit filed, those of us who did private law practices, very early in the process, we'd sit down and see if you couldn't negotiate a settlement on it. I mean, and now with the growth of restorative practices like mediation and arbitration and restorative circles around, the idea that is you solve those things earlier. Well, Des Moines won't do that. And it just appalls me that Des Moines thinks that they want to try to protect their cops by going to the U.S. Supreme Court on what is a local civil matter, when what they ought to be doing is sitting down and trying to heal that kind of wound that is still there on it. And they just won't do it. So that's one of the things I want that to change. I want my city to take what is a human approach to these kind of problems so that we're talking to each other, and not at this crossheads of litigation. It goes to my comment, Dana, about the scared cops. It'd be helpful to people that I've been working with over these last years to sit down with officers who were open to the prospect saying, when I got out there, I thought you were the worst demon in the entire world. And now that we've had a chance to talk through what gone on, maybe not. That would change our world some, wouldn't it?